Welcome to the Center for Global Humanities. My name is Anwar Majid. I'm the director of the center. A lot of people may help me make this happen. Pam Nice, who's also teaching the course related to the lecture series, the seminar series. Liz Bennett, she just stepped out, but she's absolutely instrumental in arranging the logistics. Neil Jandro and David Diego out in the booth there, they're filming and organizing and taking care of everything else. And members of the public, the Pattersons and others like them who have been very supportive of the center. George Young and his wife, Pat, who an old-time member of the center and a research fellow of the center. So we are among a group of people who are very interested and excited about ideas, and they're very eager to engage the speaker tonight in a lively conversation about justice and the law. We are very also delighted to be inviting tonight Craig McEwen from Bowdoin College. He has a very distinguished career. I'm going to read some of it, and then I will let him present, and then we'll follow with a conversation. The whole event will last no more than an hour and a half. We should wrap up no later than 7:20, 7:30 max. So it will be a presentation, Q&As, and then people can go their ways. So the topic today is solving problems, resolving disputes, and finding justice. And the presenter, as I just said, is Professor Craig McEwen, who is a Daniel Fairweather Professor of Political Economy and Sociology at Bowdoin College, where he has taught since 1975. And by the way, he knows he knows Al Fuchs, who was a former board member of the UNEs. He's very good friends. And he also knows our colleague, Brian Duff, who's spending a year at Bowdoin, who told me he has an office upstairs, right? He's upstairs, okay. You are downstairs, okay. And but anyway, in any case, Craig McEwen is a graduate of Oberlin College. He has a bachelor's degrees from there and Harvard, MA and PhD. His research and commentary on mediation programs, courts, and lawyer professionalism have appeared in law reviews, social science journals, and professional magazines. With Lynn Mather and Richard Mayman, he co-authored Divorce Lawyers at Work, Varieties of Professionalism in Practice. In 2011, the third edition of his legal treatise with Nancy Rogers, Mediation, Law, Policy, Practice, was published with added co-authors Sarah Cole, James Coben, and Peter Thompson. He has taught at Morgan State University and Ohio State's Moritz College of Law, and he has chaired Maine's Committee on Judicial Responsibility and Disability, and has served on Maine's Board of Overseers of the Bar and its Grievance Commission. Please help me welcome Professor Craig McEwen.
Good evening. This makes me feel at home when I teach at Bowdoin. Nobody sits in the front row.
That's a problem I have,
Thanks for your generous introduction, Anwar. I'm delighted to be here and honored to have been invited to participate in the seminar series of the Center for Global Humanities. As the introduction may have hinted, I'm here to some degree under false pretenses. You'll hear more than an echo tonight of my social science training and bent, but I asked the committed Center for Global Humanities scholars to read a book by an official humanist, historian Gerald Auerbach, as background for the talk tonight. And you'll hear references throughout to his analysis of justice without law. These PowerPoints have little substance. They're guideposts and visual distractions, but little more than that till we get to the videos. Throughout our time together, we'll have to think about basic human questions regarding needs, values, interests, and welfare, and the ways they're served in resolving disputes, as well as how they relate to justice. To establish my humanities credentials, let's begin with a 1977 grant from the Maine Council for the Humanities and Public Policy to a committee of dispute resolvers in Portland. The grant helped fund a 3-day training for humanist mediators who would then begin to mediate small claims cases in the Portland courts. I was among those trained in 1978. Today, Maine's Court Alternative Dispute Resolution Service, which grew out of this project, annually provides statewide over 4,000 mediations in family cases, over 1,000 in small claims, and nearly 500 in eviction cases. Many hundreds more mediations occur in civil litigation in Superior Court. And across the U.S., the use of alternative dispute settlement generally, and mediation in particular, has exploded in the last 30 or so years since that Humanities Council grant and since Auerbach wrote his book. This pattern is reflected worldwide. For example, the German Bundestag recently passed a mediation act promoting the use of out-of-court settlement. In Sri Lanka, hundreds of thousands of mediations occur under the auspices of the 1988 Mediation Boards Act. And the National Argentine Mediation Plan developed and institutionalized court-sponsored mediation in the 1990s. And so it goes around the globe. In writing Justice Without Law nearly 30 years ago, Gerald Auerbach doubted the possibility of meaningful alternative dispute settlement outside courts in the highly legalized contemporary world. But history has to some degree outdistanced the historian. Even though Auerbach also got much right. And innovation, experience, and scholarship have prompted new perspectives on alternative dispute settlement since he wrote his book. My goal this evening is to acquaint you with some of the contemporary variety and excitement of informal dispute settlement, and to identify several newer perspectives that help us see it with different eyes than did Auerbach in 1983. The importance of perspective is illustrated by Maine storyteller Kendall Morse. He recounts the story of the Mainer who was down on the lakeshore during hunting season. Nearby was a hunter from Rhode Island, well enclosed in a duck blind. The Mainer watched for a bit to see how the hunting went. A mallard passed over the duck blind and the Rhode Islanders shot it. As soon as the duck hit the water, the hunter sent his dog out to get it. The strange part of it was that the dog actually walked on the water, picked up the duck in his mouth, and walked back on the water to the blind. A little while later, the same thing happened again with the dog walking on the water to get the duck. After seeing this twice, the Mainer struck up a conversation with the hunter. He asked him how the hunting was and commented on the weather, but said nothing about the dog. Finally, the Rhode Island hunter couldn't stand it any longer and asked proudly, "Did you notice anything unusual about my dog?" The Mainer hesitated for a moment and then, a bit embarrassed, replied, "Yep, poor thing can't swim." I've used this story too often to highlight the vital importance of viewpoint in understanding and interpreting the world around us. And varying perspectives on dispute settlement can be framed much as Kendall Morse framed views of the hunting dog in this story. Early critics, such as Auerbach, saw the alternative dispute settlement movement emerging in the 1970s as hollow and meaningless because the poor thing wasn't independent of law and couldn't reconstitute fragile communities, which he saw as the primary basis for alternatives to formal law and courts. On the other hand, Many uncritical early advocates of alternative dispute settlement, especially mediation, saw it as walking on water. Thanks to many later scholars and practitioners, new perspectives have emerged that help us to view dispute settlement differently. So a quick outline of tonight's talk. First, a summary of Auerbach's perspective to engage, I hope, those of you who read it, and to catch up those of you who have not. Second, a brief general picture of the breadth and depth of contemporary dispute resolution, and then 5 more detailed examples of its variety. Third, an account of some new research and perspectives, much from social science, that have developed in interaction with these varied initiatives. Fourth, a couple of important warnings from Auerbach to ensure that we don't see alternative dispute settlement as walking on water. And finally, a concluding flourish that connects these newer social science perspectives with one based on a values argument. I hope this will leave you with new perspectives to frame your understanding of alternative dispute settlement. In Justice Without Law, Auerbach told the story of changing dispute settlement practices among European settlers beginning in the 17th century. And he took his readers up to the emergence of what is known as ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution, in the 1970s. He described, for example, the powerful role in 1640 of the Dedham, Massachusetts religious community, and later of early 20th century immigrant communities in managing disputes without resort to law. He then recounted the breakdown of isolated, tightly knit communities and the parallel growth of law. His central argument was simple: where community ends, law begins. The success of non-legal dispute settlement, he argued, has always depended upon a coherent community vision. From this perspective, informal dispute settlement without strong communal bonds has little value, but is a primary step, preliminary step in litigation, the only other option in a legalized world. For Auerbach and other critics of the revival of informal dispute settlement of the 1970s, the choices were stark: community-embedded dispute settlement or law-dominated dispute settlement, dispute settlement with or without lawyers, dispute settlement entirely independent of courts or in courts. Now, time out from Auerbach for a minute or two to clarify what informal dispute settlement means for us today, because the choices are not so stark as those he underlined. Let's think over simply of a continuum of informal to formal dispute settlement. At the most informal end is decision-making controlled by parties in conflict based on their own values and priorities. Say negotiation between marriage partners about where to vacation. At the other most formal end, we find the highly ritualized procedures in a court that lead to a binding resolution of a dispute by a judge based on legal rules and precedent. And in between, there are all manner of other options, most typically involving some form of negotiation by parties on their own or with the assistance of friends, of lawyers, of mediators. At the end closest to court, we might find negotiation literally or figuratively on the courthouse steps. In my view tonight, unlike Auerbach's, alternative dispute settlement processes are almost any of those that fall short of that radical, extreme, formal decision-making by a court. And indeed, the last example that I will provide for you, the Red Hook Community Court, is a court itself, but one that does much more than adjudicate. Many of the alternatives that I'll talk about involve some help to parties in reaching an agreement, and this intervention is often called mediation. In mediation, the third party has no authority to dictate a result, and mediation, like negotiation, does not always lead to an agreement. I'll pay little heed until the end of the talk tonight to another alternative that Auerbach describes, arbitration, which essentially is private adjudication. Think about it as the formal endpoint. Court is up here, arbitration here, and there's a kind of a detour from that continuum, with arbitration providing another formal endpoint. Okay, timeout's over. Back to Auerbach briefly. In his view, contemporary American legal culture emphasizes the competitive, individualistic character of life and adversarial law. In this problematic view, the use of law and lawsuits has exploded in the United States because our culture emphasizes litigiousness and because of an absence of communal alternatives for managing disputes. Thus, in vastly overstated language, Auerbach claims that aggressive struggle within a highly structured framework of rules in pursuit of territory and victory is the ultimate American national pastime, in law as in football. Because true informal dispute settlement, in his view, belongs only to tightly knit small communities, Auerbach claimed, the relentless force of law in modern American society can be measured by its domination and virtual annihilation of alternative forms of dispute settlement. Now let's bring Auerbach's analysis back to Maine. In some sense, the development of mediation here mirrors Auerbach's analysis, but condenses several hundred years of history into 2 or 3. Before the 1977 humanities grant, there was an earlier one in 1976 that funded a community dispute resolution project at the University of Maine Law School. It trained 12 humanists in community mediation, but it turned out they couldn't gain entry into any disputes. No one in community disputes wanted mediation. The project died for want of opportunities to put it into practice, but not for long. Portland attorney Walter Corey saw the potential of mediation in court cases and argued that it could help courts reduce their caseload burden. Thus, in 2 short years, Maine community mediation had become a court mediation service. Its fate appears to demonstrate that informal dispute settlement outside of legal institutions has no contemporary possibility. And this same pattern recurred throughout the United States, as the community mediation programs that dominated this new venture, alternative dispute settlement, struggled with low caseloads until they, too, associated themselves to court. That was the contemporary alternative dispute settlement world that Auerbach saw in 1983. But the world has changed considerably since then. So where are we today? In 2012, alternative dispute settlement has come much further and taken different forms than could have been anticipated in 1983. But it's also lived up to some of Auerbach's predictions and fears. As he anticipated, much alternative dispute settlement has been thoroughly legalized. One measure of that is the size of the legal treatise on the practice of law and mediation that I've been a co-author of. In 1989, when first published, it was a god-awful 839 pages long. On your left. The new 2011 edition runs 3,458 pages. The law of informal dispute settlement has multiplied. So has attorney involvement in delivering alternative dispute settlement. The American Bar Association's dispute resolution section was not established until 1993, but its website describes it as one of the ABA's fastest growing sections, now with 19,000 members. Because the early 1970s and 1980s mediation initiatives focused on small or minor disputes, as the American Bar Association so inaptly termed them, Auerbach and other critics worried that a two-track justice system was developing, with one track, mediation for low-income groups and minor disputes, and the other, an adjudication track for business and government with big disputes. Although court-connected community mediation centers mediate tens of thousands of small claims and landlord-tenant and other cases in many states, ranging from New York to Nebraska, they are now at the periphery of contemporary dispute settlement. Indeed, today, a different two-track model of justice looms. This one encourages litigants with resources to hire mediators and too often leaves poorly financed courts to parties with fewer resources. First-class justice in the United States today often means mediation. In fact, major corporations and corporate law firms, through the organization known as CPR, and that has a different meaning, I realize, here at UNE, now promote alternatives to resolve business disputes. 4,000 companies and 1,500 corporate law firms have pledged to do so. Several large firms, such as JAMS, which used to be Judicial and Arbitration Mediation Service, but now just goes by JAMS, provide talented lawyer mediators at high prices to meet this growing demand, and many law firms offer ADR services. Although Auerbach missed the future embrace of alternative dispute settlement by large businesses, he predicted much of their surface rationale for doing so, a focus on efficiency by reducing the costs and delays of court litigation. The boom in private alternative dispute settlement with lawyer mediators has been paralleled by growth in family mediation, where Maine was also a leader when in 1983 it required divorce mediation in contested cases involving minor children. Today, many of the nation's domestic relations courts, like Massachusetts and Michigan, follow Maine's lead in compelling participation in mediation by parties who contest custody or visitation. And mediation is used across the country in thousands of divorce-related disputes. The rationale for the explosion of family mediation has not been efficiency, however, but rather a recognition of the limits of legal processes in dealing with highly personal and variable human conflicts, and the belief that mediation can humanize the resolution process, help empower parties, and let them tailor results to fit their special circumstances within the bounds of law. Another vital growth area of alternative dispute settlement has been in the arena of policy disputes and policy planning, a field which has helped open up widely used new tools to help prevent and resolve conflict, including facilitation, collaboration, and policy dialogue. National firms such as Resolve and Keystone do this work. And new thinking has focused on dispute system design, looking at patterns of disputes and creating systems not only for resolving large numbers of them effectively and efficiently, but also for using information from them to identify and change organizational practices that produce the disputes to begin with. Now let's examine in more detail 5 radically different examples that run roughly along my continuum from informal, non-legal resolution to and through the courthouse door to a transformed court. Chicago continues to have a well-earned reputation as one of the nation's most violent cities for young people, even though it's experienced a 50% decline in homicides over 20 years. To help address the issue of youth violence, Ceasefire Chicago began working with youths in high-violence neighborhoods in 1995. At first, Ceasefire relied on caseworkers to assist young people in finding jobs, going back to school, and leaving gangs. Then the program director suggested mediating gang-related disputes as a way to further reduce violence. With the blessing of police, neighbors, faith communities, and public officials, Ceasefire began to train former gang members in mediation. They understood that in communities where respect is a scarce resource, perceived and real insults can easily lead to violence and then to retaliation. In cases of interpersonal, neighborhood, and gang conflicts and shootings, these violence interrupters spoke with gang members, relatives, and friends of victims, urging them to see their interests in not retaliating and to find nonviolent ways to deal with their anger and fear. As a result of Ceasefire's work, the incidence of retaliatory shootings dropped markedly, and 6 of 7 Ceasefire neighborhoods studied by Northwestern researchers became significantly safer. The work of Ceasefire Chicago was brought to screen last year in an extraordinary 2011 documentary, The Interrupters, which you can now see on the web through Frontline on the public broadcasting system. It's a must-see, and here is.
Come on, you can make it.
I'm not no punk or nothing.
Yeah.
The only thing came to my mind was retaliating. They got to know they did the wrong person.
Yeah.
Well, it was a violent night in Chicago. 9 people were shot in just 5 hours.
124 people have been killed so far this year, about the number of Americans killed during the same period in Iraq. and Afghanistan combined.
Violence is like the great infectious diseases. We're using the methods that are used for reversing any epidemic.
Have there been any conflicts mediated on the front end?
The last 30 days has been nothing but violence. We've had, I think it's 18 shootings in the last 16 days, 10 of them dead.
Most of the violence interrupters come from the hierarchy in some of these gangs. Because can't know anybody come in and tell a guy to put his gun down. I have the dirty dozen at the table.
I was 11 years old when my father got killed. He got beat with some baseball bats. And that just messed me up. Started getting myself in trouble. I always found myself thinking about, man, I wish my daddy was here. Just to see how I changed and doing something positive, productive, so he could be proud of me.
In order to stop a killing, you have to be able to intercept whispers. You have to work with the have-littles in America. And this is not easy work, because there's no way to resolve conflicts without confrontation.
When I let loose, goddamn, they gonna know. Shouldn't have crossed me. I'm not with ceasefire.
But still, though, man, you got to try to leave that shit alone, though,
I ain't
man.
leaving shit alone until I get these motherfuckers.
But you was locked up before for the same shit, though.
Man, I've been locked up 15 years in my life. What that mean?
We just
try to offer you options and solutions to the problem.
Man, fuck this shit. Fuck a problem. Fuck a solution.
It's a rough one. But anytime you got a person who will stay there and talk with you, you got a chance of working it out with them. We could go out.
When?
That's what you want to do.
When?
We could go out now.
Right now?
Yeah.
Let me go put my pistol up.
When I was 18, a very close friend of mine was shot. I walked around with a gun on me and just hoping somebody would just come up to me and say, man, what's up? What you is? To this day, everything I do for my victim.
This is where I got clean. This is my colostomy bag.
You end up shooting the guy, man, and the guys were getting killed or dying. Now what? What name did you make up for yourself? Because now you're going to jail, man.
Or doing 30 years.
I want to be able to help out. Some people, I can't. Even as much as I want to, they don't want the help.
Police in Chicago charged 3 teenagers with first-degree murder today.
Darian Albert was attacked as he walked home from school. I seen the video, and it just hit me like a ton of bricks. The first thing that I said was, oh man, I hope his mother does not see this. And I look at my sisters and my brothers today, that was once me.
This is unacceptable for me to be holding this young man's obituary. Let this be a wake-up call. Let this be a stop call.
Who does this baby belong to?
He just hanging around y'all, right? So he see everything that you all do, right? So if this brother right here catch a case, whose fault is it?
Our fault.
Teach him righteous. You got it?
The violence interrupters have one goal in mind every day: stop killings. They're not trying to dismantle gangs. What they're trying to do is save a life.
I held him to his last breath. I didn't want to let him go.
As much as please, Almighty God.
All we want to know is what happened in this situation. How can we resolve it? And how can people live in peace and coexist?
Powerful, powerful stuff. Second example, eBay. eBay began a dispute settlement process for users just weeks after opening its online sales business in 1995, believing that people would use it more if they had a way to resolve conflicts. Early efforts used hundreds of mediators to help resolve disputes online, but at a cost to disputants. By 2003, it became clear, however, that people with a $50 dispute didn't want to pay $30 for an online mediator. The service was underutilized, and eBay users have as many as 40 million disputes a year in varied languages So online mediators couldn't conceivably keep up with the demand. They decided to create an online interactive system and to pay for it themselves. Through surveys of users, they found that people who were arguing over relatively small amounts of money would rather have a quick decision than a perfect process. So they developed software, tailoring the software to a particular kind of dispute and employing language translations. The software helps parties communicate and negotiate and provides tips for constructive exchanges with the trading partner. It urges parties to continue communicating until you've resolved the case. But it also indicates if you aren't able to work things out, based on the online record, one of our eBay customer support persons will decide the case at the conclusion, a form of arbitration, I suppose. eBay attended to dispute prevention, not just resolution, in designing its systems. They send out a notice after 3 days that normal delivery takes more than 3 days to cut off disputes over delivery. It modified its online language to lessen the likelihood of escalation, for example, replacing the words case and complaint with words like issue and problem. eBay's internal analysis showed this revised dispute resolution system increased user satisfaction, reduced customer service calls, enhanced user retention, and promoted growth in online sales. United States Postal Service. We all know the phrase going postal, meaning becoming extremely, perhaps uncontrollably angry, probably in a workplace setting. Indeed, 35 people were killed in 11 post office shootings between 1983 and 93. In the U.S. Postal Service, workplace conflicts had no clear internal outlet and led to large numbers of complaints to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which couldn't do much with them because very few of the complaints alleged discrimination, their business, though they often alleged problematic workplace patterns. So the U.S. Post Office designed Redress, resolve employment disputes, reach equitable solutions swiftly in 1994. It put in place a mediation process with the goal not just of processing complaints, but rooting out workplace issues and resolving them. Disputing parties meet with a mediator who assists them in discussing and resolving the problem and strives to change the ongoing interaction between the parties. When outside evaluators studied the system, they learned over 90% of complainants and supervisors viewed the mediators as respectful, impartial, and fair, reflecting what I'll later call a sense of procedural justice. Interviews carried out before and after implementation indicated a substantial decline in employee reports, that supervisors dealt with conflict by yelling, arguing, disciplining, and intimidating their opponents, and a large increase in open door communication. That is, the organization changed. Voluntary use of redress went up, EEOC filings went down. Example 4, pioneering hospitals have largely dropped the deny and defend strategy for dealing with medical errors and malpractice lawsuits. These institutions have alternative dispute resolution systems to identify and investigate medical errors when they occur and provide patients with clear and complete information about what happened. This approach builds on research about injured parties involved in lawsuits that makes clear that most have very mixed goals. Rarely are they in it only or even mainly for the money. Instead, they want and expect information, explanations, and apologies after medical errors. And physicians indicate they want to apologize, but in the deny and defend strategy, we're prevented from meeting with patients to do so. Hospitals now know that reluctance to disclose information and meet personally with patients and families actually drives patients to lawyers' offices. The University of Michigan Hospital is one that has implemented a system for managing unanticipated patient outcomes. It relies on a quick review, thorough review of claims by patients and by reports of physicians, nurses, of unanticipated patient outcomes. The reviews determine what happened, why, and whether or not the care in question was reasonable. The results of the review are shared with all parties concerned. When care was inappropriate, apologies are made, open discussion occurs with patient, and if there is one, attorney, and compensation offered. The result? Managers at U of M Hospital report the new system cut in half medical malpractice claims. Processing time fell from 20 to 8 months, and the hospital reduced its litigation costs by 50%. A series of management and clinical improvements also resulted. For example, use of patient safety coordinators and adoptions of new technology to better monitor patient care. Problem-solving courts. The focus that the alternative dispute resolution settlement perspective has brought to problem-solving as compared to rule application has helped to open up a series of innovative new versions of community justice centers. Let's visit the Red Hook neighborhood in Brooklyn to learn about one of their pioneering courts.
In the spring of 2000, the Red Hook Community Justice Center opened its doors in Brooklyn, New York, in a neighborhood plagued by unemployment, poverty, and crime. Red Hook is isolated from the rest of Brooklyn by a massive expressway. Once a busy commercial port, Red Hook suffered heavy job losses in the 60s. In the 70s and 80s, heroin and crack cocaine devastated the community. And in 1992, Red Hook hit rock bottom when a local tragedy made national news.
The turning point for the community was the murder of the principal from the school, Patrick Daly. And I was actually a detective in the housing police department at that time and worked briefly on the case. And to think that a principal looking for a student who happened to run away from school would result in a homicide, I think the community said enough is enough.
When I went to the wake, many residents expressed that anger. And I knew that the chief judge, Judith Kay, had in concept thought that having a local community court would be a good thing.
Judge Kay took that idea, developed that idea through the Center for Court Innovation, and really put together this court.
But today we're opening what I believe will be an exciting new model for the court system well into this century, the Red Hook Community Justice Center. People will be coming here to find out how to do it in the rest of the city and the rest of the country.
We can be part of the solution, not just part of the problem, because we are part of the problem. The courts are part of the problem when they simply take in a drug addict, adjudicate the case, and put out a drug addict on the streets. And we are doing that over and over and over again. We don't have to do that. We can do better than that.
I think the underlying concept that animates the Justice Center is what we would call problem-solving justice. And that's the idea that courts shouldn't process cases like widgets in a factory, but that they should really try to solve the problems that bring people to court.
Before the court opened, Justice Center planners spent several years soliciting community feedback through focus groups, door-to-door surveys, and town hall meetings.
We needed to do something to improve safety
in Red Hook. So when we heard of the Justice Center, we said, great.
Located in a renovated Catholic school, the Red Hook Community Justice Center offers a coordinated approach where a single judge hears cases involving family problems, landlord-tenant disputes, and low-level felonies and misdemeanors, like prostitution, drug possession, and other quality-of-life offenses. Criminal offenders are required to pay back the community by performing visible restitution.
I want you to do is conditions of release, job readiness, the life choices group, and the marijuana group. Whereas downtown I only have jail or out, here I have a number of different tools to use to get to that person's problem so that they don't come back in front of me again.
If you don't have a system like this that is trying to offer the help, trying to give the help, a lot of times these people, they're going to be in jail for 30 days and they'll go right back into the environment that put them there in the first place.
You ever been to this court, have you? Okay, this court's a lot different than courts you're used to, okay?
Yeah.
A lot of what we do here is essentially trying to help the defendants overcome their drug dependency or some other problems that they may have, with a goal of getting them to lead crime-free lives. He's one that we're recommending for treatment. Let the defense attorney know too, so the clinic can sort of start seeing them right away.
When a person is placed into treatment, we monitor that treatment very carefully.
Another success story that should complete today. What's fascinating about him is that he's a homeless vet and he's clean, like for the first time in like 20 years. So we're pretty excited about that.
Sometimes a court has to use jail as a tool, just like the treatment is used as a tool, sometimes jail is used as a tool. It's usually the last resort. I'm sentencing you to jail for the rest of today, tomorrow, Sunday, part of Monday, and on Tuesday I want you back here, and I'm going to want to hear what you're going to do. But it's sometimes that short jail period that really gets the person to understand that if he or she continues down that road, this is exactly where it's going to get you. I'm proud about a lot of cases that have been in front of me, mostly involving some of our graduates from the drug treatment.
I just want to say that I'm grateful for this court and for all that's a part of it. And even though there was some resistance on my part, I couldn't be more happier the way things turning out.
Obviously, this is a good result for you. It's also a great result for the community. And I'd like to give you a round of applause.
Not usual to have applause in a courtroom. Public trust in Red Hook courts has skyrocketed since the inception of this court. Perceptions of fairness and compliance with court requirements for community service are high. Fear of crime has fallen, and many individual lives have been dramatically changed. So 5 dramatically different examples. What can we learn from these? One, that tightly knit communities are not required in order for alternative dispute settlement to work. Mediation and problem-solving approaches, not only in courts, but also in communities, either through the formal legal system, as in Red Hook, or very much outside of it in Ceasefire. It can also work in formal organizations like the Postal Service, hospital, or eBay. Second, much alternative dispute settlement appears to work because it helps aggrieved parties who struggle to resolve conflict peacefully on their own. It does so by assisting them in thinking through their own interests in the context of processes that value communication, understanding of other circumstances, and mutual respect. Third, well-designed disputing systems can not only efficiently process many individual disputes, but also can produce organizational and relational changes that reduce future conflicts. Let's build on these brief summary observations to examine 6 points about new social science knowledge and practice that have both grown out of and helped frame these innovations. First, a crucial shift in perspective has come over the last 30 years from the recognition among lawyers and social scientists that even in the world of law and litigation, negotiation, not adjudication, is and has long been the dominant form of resolution. Indeed, over the last decade, legal commentators have worried about the loss of trials. The portion of federal civil cases resolved by trial fell from 12% in 1962 to less than 2% in 2002. Negotiation and settlement in the shadow of the law are overwhelmingly the dominant form of legal decision-making. And elsewhere in life, negotiation has been increasingly recognized as a fundamental part of our daily existence. Thus, even in the competitive individualistic world of the 20th and 21st centuries, alternative dispute settlement through negotiation has been growing even without strong communal bonds. Second, the new attention to negotiation has meant that law schools, along with business schools, teach courses in negotiation, and both scholarly research and popular writing about how and why people negotiate and how they do it well has exploded. Getting to Yes, published in 1981, and many editions since, was one of the first works in this area, arguing for principled negotiation that was fair to others while advancing each negotiator's interests. Fisher and Urey argued that very few conflicts are zero-sum games where what one party wins, the other loses. Instead, if negotiating parties understand not only their own interests, but also those of the other party, they can find ways to invent options for mutual gain and achieve win-win solutions. Their perspective ties negotiation not to abstract legal rules and principles, but to a broad range of human and relational needs and interests, and clearly attends to problem solving in the context of organizations, relationships, and transactions. During the last 30 years, research also grew on what social psychologists call procedural justice, how people perceive that they are treated in the course of dealing with their disputes. The research clearly shows that perceptions of disputing process matter more to disputants than do the outcomes of the disputes. Procedural justice research highlights several crucial dimensions of the experience of procedure: the chance to have input and be heard, to feel that procedures are even-handed, to be treated respectfully by the other party, and to develop trust of the other party. Fourth, not only have researchers and practitioners focused on the centrality of negotiation and importance of fair and respectful process, but they've also come to recognize the limits of unassisted negotiation. Few of us are skilled in negotiation, and all of us face cognitive and strategic barriers in making negotiation work effectively for us. For example, the negotiator's dilemma, the tension between sharing information with the other party in order to produce the best outcome and holding back information for fear that a competitive negotiating partner will take advantage of that information, means many negotiated outcomes don't achieve optimal results. Fifth, in the context of new understandings of procedural justice and negotiation and the barriers to doing it effectively, we've come to see alternative dispute settlement in a new light. We now understand the potential of mediation, primarily in relation to unassisted negotiation rather than to court adjudication. We see its capacity to overcome many of the barriers to effective negotiation and to enhance procedural justice by allowing parties to participate directly, speak and be heard, and be treated respectfully. This new understanding and perspective thus embeds the practice of alternative dispute settlement not in community, as Auerbach did, but rather in relation to the more immediate and situated problems of individuals and organizations with particular interests and needs. Sixth, new knowledge and perspectives also highlight the value of effective problem solving and the limits of courts in their ability to solve problems by applying rules and procedures. The emphasis on problem solving demands a deeper understanding of human interests, emotions, and relationships. The focus on problem solving, as I noted earlier, has given birth to this new field of dispute system design. Now, very quickly, though this is beginning to sound like the Rhode Island hunter's view of the dog, let's remember that Auerbach reminded us early on that dispute resolution, alternative dispute settlement, doesn't walk on water. And two issues that he pointed to. The first of these is with the inexorable legalization of dispute settlement in our time. Indeed, there's much to worry about because mediation and negotiation are often heavily shadowed by courts and law and often focus almost entirely on legally relevant issues that matter to courts, not on the emotions, motives, relationships, explanations of events, moral accountability, and planning for the future that matter more to parties. Second concern Auerbach raised in 1983 was that alternative dispute settlement could block access to justice, meaning for him access to courts, especially for parties with few resources. The growth of mandatory arbitration built into the contracts we all have with cell phone providers, credit card providers, and sometimes with employers does just that. I don't have time tonight to develop that concern, but I suggest that you look at the documentary Hot Coffee, which has a very strong viewpoint about this and challenges you to think about Auerbach's views of hyperlexis, of over-legalization of too many lawsuits. A great 2010, I think, documentary. These two important concerns shouldn't turn us away from the important grounds for optimism about mediation and its problem-solving offshoots that have come from experience in social science research. So let's review as we draw to a close here. Auerbach argued that in a legalized world where communities are weak, alternative dispute settlement is nothing more than a way of achieving judicial efficiency. And many of the arguments for mediation, including those of the 1977 proposal to the Humanities Council in Maine, have underlined efficiency goals, reducing the caseload of courts, for example. Substantial new knowledge about negotiation and procedural justice, however, have added new perspectives that push us to look beyond the efficiencies of time and money to the quality of processes and outcomes achieved. We've repeatedly seen from the examples of ceasefire, eBay, Postal Service, Michigan Hospital, Red Hook Community Court, the limits of formal law in identifying and resolving underlying disputes that generate conflict and in preventing future disputes. The knowledge emerging from practice and social scientific study of negotiation have opened up exciting new frontiers of system design to reduce the number of disputes as well as process them. We know that alternative dispute settlement, particularly through mediation, can deliver better outcomes and greater sense of procedural justice to parties in conflict by improving negotiation and focusing on problem solving rather than rule application. Implicit in this alternative social science view is a set of concerns about improving human relationships and recognizing the complex and not always consistent goals of disputing parties. And often buried even deeper can be some fundamental value commitments. Law professor Robert Baruch Bush spells these out. He, like Auerbach, identifies the formal law with a competitive and individualistic set of values. The premise of formal law, he says, is that autonomous individual choice and therefore the freedom of the individual to accomplish his own self-fulfillment, defined in his own terms, is the highest value in the social enterprise. Auerbach stopped there in looking at alternative dispute settlement, believing that without strong communities and in contemporary culture, it could represent nothing more than an adjunct to the formal law in advancing individual self-interest in a competitive world. Baruch Bush takes a different view and helps us find some deeper human roots for the explosion and successes of alternative dispute settlement that Auerbach thought unlikely. Baruch Bush contends that mediation can support the fulfillment of the individual's capacity for moral development, for going beyond self-interest and being concerned with others. And second, the discovery of a common good beyond any private vision of the good through the encounter between self and others in shared discourse and action. He goes on to say, education in self-determination and consideration for others, the mediator's value, is crucial for the promotion of individual moral development and a shared search for a common good. This hopeful view lay at the heart of the early involvement of Maine humanists in mediation. Indeed, in a 1981 article on humanists as mediators, one of Maine's first humanist mediators, Roy Greason, a professor of English at Bowdoin and later college president, saw well beyond the court efficiency rationale that justified the 1977 proposal to the Humanities Council. He observed that Maine mediators are a remarkably compassionate group of men and women, not in a sentimental way, but in their belief that human beings should be encouraged to treat one another fairly and with dignity. Therein lies the promise and potential of mediation as alternative dispute resolution from a humanist perspective. Thank you.
A couple of quick comments. I'm sure Peter is delighted to know that the Maine Humanities Council played a role in promoting mediation in the state of Maine. And anybody who wants to ask a question, there's a microphone on each side of the room. And please use the microphone to ask your questions.
Since you're a professor at Bowdoin College, I was wondering if you could share some examples of community mediation that you see, like in everyday life, amongst students or colleagues.
Well, interesting question. One of the developments not reflected at Bowdoin is the development of on-campus mediation services in many colleges and universities. At Bowdoin, though we don't have a campus mediation service, residential life staff are trained in mediation skills, and they become a crucial part, an important part of their day-to-day work with students. You could imagine possibly conflicts with roommates, for example, or with other students, and they become grist for the mill in residential life work. So the attentiveness to mediation as a skill, a life skill, has great application in that context. One of the things, we have a limited amount of community mediation in Maine today. The Volunteers of America of Northern New England has taken leadership in keeping going an association of community mediators. But that enterprise has not as much life as it does in some other states. Mediation skills generally are taught in a variety of settings. They're often, as happened in 1976, more people trained to do mediation than there are opportunities in a formal way to do it. But many people, as residential life personnel, find those skills extremely valuable in managing day-to-day problems and relationships. I hope that's at least partly responsive to your question.
Hi, up here.
Hi. Excuse me. I've worked in the financial services industry for over 25 years, and it is an industry that has always not only embraced but required every client and every employee to sign dispute agreements that will be resolved through arbitration rather than a court system. And I'm interested in your thoughts on that, which really hasn't evolved as all of your examples have.
And that's perhaps the hot coffee example, which is highly critical of of mandatory arbitration, which essentially means that once somebody enters arbitration, they have no access to courts. That's it. They've given up their rights to sue. They've reduced the rights or the opportunities to undertake class actions. And many credit card users or cell phone users don't have big complaints. They may worry about charges of a few dollars or some problem. And essentially, within the legal system, those problems, either in arbitration or adjudication, are not resolvable because it costs more to resolve them than they're worth, sort of like the early eBay experience. And arbitration was seen as an efficient way to deal with some of those problems. But what it has meant, and it has been arguably used by financial services industry and other industries, to make it more difficult for consumers to group together in order to sue the provider of the service together in a way that would make that lawsuit financially feasible and would provide the legal protections of court. So this is, it's an area the United States Supreme Court has basically said this is appropriate. There's a strong legal rationale for continuing it. Many of those who work in the area of dispute resolution are very concerned about mandatory arbitration and wish that it weren't there because for some committed to the sort of values that I've talked about, it does not embody those values and takes on the kind of, provides the block to access to justice that Auerbach was worried about in writing in 1983.
In Auerbach's book, there's a lot of talk about how the litigation system sort of serves the people who have the most money the best, basically. And so to fix that, the trend seems to be, like with the case of the interrupters and so on, to move towards arbitration or mediation, all that. But I was wondering if there's something intrinsic to litigation that makes it so unfair, as it were, or is there something causing this unfairness that can be mediated?
That would take more than a short answer. That's a great question. Two components, at least, to the answer. One is that To some degree, law is not simply a reflection of the democratic process. Law is created by legislatures and lobbyists, and lobbyists come from parts of the economy but don't broadly represent the populace. So lawmaking, to some degree, may be biased in favor of those with greater resources because they're more attentive to their self-interests, have broad self-interests, and are able to influence legislation. So that might be part of the advantage. And then it's expensive to go to court and to use a formal legal system. So the old cartoon, which Auerbach quotes, of the client visiting a lawyer, and the lawyer asked, well, how much justice can you afford? It's very expensive to litigate. And that's not because lawyers are evil, that's because they're professionals. They need to be paid appropriately. The court process is time-consuming, rule-bound, and that's at least part of the argument for mediation as a way to short-circuit, in this sense, efficiency, but to provide opportunities for people to take a lead role themselves, to take some responsibility for decision-making, rather than to have representatives do it. And in this new world where mediation may be seen in some ways as first-class justice, it's finding ways to provide mediation opportunities to a broader array of individuals situated in the community, in Chicago, in courts in Maine through the Court Alternative Dispute Resolution Service, and through community mediation centers, but in other settings as well, such as college or university mediation. So Auerbach argues fundamentally that the law is unequal and advantages those with greater resources. At the same time, we are fortunate to have a rule of law in our society because it means that those who are powerless can at times and have access to justice and hold accountable those with much more power and resources than they have. And that's one of the beauties of a legal system. But it doesn't make everybody equal.
I was interested in the delay factor and how important that is to people who use alternative dispute resolution. My experience is that it's an important part of it, that they can get a decision or a resolution much quicker than through the formal court system.
Yes, and of course it doesn't always work that way. It doesn't walk on water necessarily. If you get involved in mediation and you don't reach a resolution, then you've got to go back to court. You may be spending more time getting there. But by and large, one of the arguments, and we wrote about this in our study of divorce lawyers, is that mediation, often imposed by a court, can prompt busy lawyers to attend to negotiation. It becomes a goad to do negotiation earlier. And that can speed up the resolution of disputes. A divorce lawyer who has 120 active cases, court dates, filings, all sorts of things, can't pay attention to each case all the time, though their clients want them to. And as a result, and then if they're going to negotiate with an attorney on the other side, they have to call up or email the attorney. They have to communicate back and forth. It becomes an awkward communication process. Got to talk to the client, client to lawyer, lawyer to lawyer, lawyer to client, back again. All of that's time-consuming and to some degree takes the client out of the process. So mediation can offer to some degree expediency. It can encourage lawyers and clients to attend to problems, and it can assist communication as well as enhance procedural justice, the sense of participation by parties. So yes, it matters, getting it done quickly, not guaranteed by alternative dispute settlement. Yes.
I know you didn't talk about it tonight, but do you think that restorative justice could ever be like a really significant form of justice in our society rather than the one that we use now? And if so, do you think it would be successful? And if not, why?
Wow. Great questions. I'm hopeful about restorative justice, which looks is contrasts with the notion of retributive justice. That is, that we're essentially paying people back for law violation. We're looking backward. It does not. Restorative justice centers the harm done and the victim, and tries to restore or create a community and a relationship that is positive going forward. Much more complicated than that, but one example of restorative justice or one technique used is victim-offender facilitation or mediation. And the restorative justice movement, in a sense, grew out of this alternative dispute settlement movement, as you're suggesting, in the 80s and 90s, and has now a great deal of worldwide momentum to it. In Maine, there is a restorative justice project up the coast. I think it's centered in Belfast. They're doing very interesting work. One of the interesting applications of restorative justice is in schools. Trying to think of school discipline in a way that doesn't use as the punishment suspension from school, which for a kid who's not very committed to school to begin with seems a little bit counterintuitive as a way to encourage engagement. And restorative justice efforts in schools try to treat offenders differently, to set up ways in which teachers and students, principals and students can communicate more directly about the harm done, which is crucial in restorative justice, because the idea is that the accountability in the kind of criminal court that preceded Red Hook criminal court is minimal at best. People are processed like widgets, and they have little encounter or no encounter with the victim. They don't see the harm that they've caused. And to the degree that we can understand the harm, or offenders can understand the harm caused, they can relate to victims, to what they're doing, and be motivated to change their behavior. One of the compelling scenes from The Interrupters is of a young man released from prison who is taken back to a hair salon to meet with the owner of the hair salon, who he and two others robbed at gunpoint 3 or 4 years before, when he was in prison. And it's an emotional setting as the woman talks about her experience, her sense of vulnerability. And the young man, this is not easy. In some ways, it was easier for him to go to jail than to face the victim. And it concludes by the woman hugging the young man and hoping that his new life, supported by the interrupters with job readiness and opportunities, will reflect his apparent new commitment. So I'm jumping around here, but this is to say, I think restorative justice has a great deal of promise. The University of Minnesota has a Center for Restorative Justice. Some states do much more with restorative justice than others. The Maine Supreme Judicial Court and the Maine Department of Corrections have embraced restorative justice as part of their purpose or their goals. Implementation is not easy and runs against our views, strong views in our society about retribution and the kind of concern that we have about crime being tough on crime. The argument of restorative justice advocates is that restorative justice is very tough on crime, but not in the ways that we tend to think about it with long sentences, for example. So I hope there's hope there, and I pay a lot of attention to restorative justice over the next decade or so in the United States.
Has there been mediation tried in the political realm or the legislative realm? And second is, are there mediation courses offered under the political science courses in colleges? And
there are, I think, very few undergraduate courses on mediation. Unfortunately. There certainly are graduate programs and programs open to the public. You can find them here in southern Maine. The political realm is an interesting realm, sort of implying that there may be conflicts that are unresolved there. And part of, again, growing out of this movement has been a move toward collaborative governance and trying to think about governance in ways that recognize a variety of interests and design processes that build collaborations rather than relying on the sustained conflict over time. And that takes many different forms across the United States. There's an organization, the name of which I'm repressing right now or not thinking of, which is trying to promote collaborative governance. There's some great examples in Maine. Early on, when we had a turnpike widening proposal years ago, there was a good deal of resistance to it from environmental groups and communities, and a good deal of support from it from those wanting to expand tourism and access to the state. And a collaborative process was developed to reach a resolution over some months. That takes skill and commitment. So it can happen in the political arena. And again, one of the, like restorative justice, one of the things to watch over the next decade or so is the development of collaborative governance initiatives here in Maine and elsewhere. So there's hope. Mediation is probably not the term, but it's an offshoot of the notion of mediation.
There's an article in the New Yorker recently that described the fact that violent crime has decreased in a hugely substantial way over the last 20, 30 years in the United States. Yet at the same time, our rate of incarceration has grown to the point that we are the highest rate in the world right now, and similar to, or even greater than Stalin's Gulag years. So I guess my main question is, do you have any hope that a new concept can replace that this can start to make an impact on our retributive culture?
a limited hope, and the major reason for the hope comes from costs. The United States actually long ago outdistanced whatever our competitors were in the world in our incarceration rates. And many states struggling with budgets, California, which in 1970 had 20,000 prisoners and today has 170,000, under court order to reduce prison populations, and having a fiscal crisis. Prisons in California used to take a distant second to higher education in terms of public funding. That's changed. So as we face the costs and consequences of the decisions we make, there are people from varied parts of the political spectrum who are raising questions about practice and looking for alternatives. Restorative justice is one of those possibilities out there. Senator James Webb of Virginia had a bill in the Senate that would have created a national commission, the first since 1967, to look at the criminal justice system and examine alternatives to it and problems with it, premised on the factual assertions that you began with. I think our senators may have been co-sponsors of that. It died in the Senate. So there are possibilities out there, and the budget pressures, if any pressures, are the likely ones to push us to a new approach. I think...
now, this would have been the last question, but I have one more question.
Oh.
And the reason I recently, not long ago, maybe a few months ago, I read an article that was so scary that I shared with a lot of people, friends and colleagues. And it's basically what it is. You mentioned about 2% of the cases go to trial in the United States. But the way they described the situation in the New York Times, the front page article, was that it is now a prosecutor's state. In other words, people are being faced and confronted with plea bargaining, and so they're foregoing the right to trial enshrined in the Constitution. And I think, you mentioned the fact that people go through mediation and so on as an alternative. But plea bargaining, the article makes it sound like we are living now in a prosecutor state, and then the judges and everybody else is kind of hand-tied, in this situation. What do you think of that?
I think that New York Times article was on the money in worrying about this issue. And for a long time, we've had plea bargaining, plea negotiation in criminal courts. And much of what I've been talking about isn't in the criminal arena. But the retributive approach empowers prosecutors because they can, under law, threaten huge penalties to people. And that induces people to plead guilty for a certain sentence that is much less than the one that might be possible under law. So the expansion of criminal penalties has enabled that process to be enlarged in the society. And on the other, and prosecutors are the key people in making the criminal justice system different. And you saw in Red Hook a commitment on the part of prosecutors to problem-solving justice, which doesn't necessarily get you reelected if you're an elected prosecutor, but it makes enormous sense in terms of protecting the public and advancing the interests of the criminal justice system. So what we need are more prosecutors who are aware of some of the options, such as those that Red Hook provides, to make a more effective criminal justice system. One of the worries that I have we could go on all night, but I know we're stopping now, is with elected prosecutors, because the public appeal at the time of election doesn't, tends to reinforce the retributive view of law. So it becomes very difficult for prosecutors in that situation to find creative solutions and to move in the Red Hook direction. Thank you all for your stimulating questions and your attention.